Hey guys, Nike here. As you might be aware, I've been playing some Guild Wars 1 lately, and over the last couple days, I completed Winds of Change in hard mode for the second time to unlock Zayre on my warrior. And I thought a lot about how Winds of Change was sort of a rough draft for living story content in Guild Wars 2, except in a lot of ways it was superior to the Guild Wars 2 living story and implementation. So I want to give an overview of it, along with my observations on what worked with Winds of Change and what didn't work, and hopefully see what we can conclude about it in regards to Guild Wars 2. Winds of Change is essentially a long 3-act quest chain released over 3 episodes over the course of 7 months. Essentially like 3 living story episodes. The quests, even in normal mode, however, were slightly above average difficulty relative to the main storyline or quest content in the game, and they did provide above average rewards. Upon completing Winds of Change, you could repeat it in hard mode for even more rewards, including unlocking a very valuable ritualist hero. I should stress that the hard mode versions of the quests were very challenging and are very challenging. And if you're not a good player using good builds, and you're not approaching some of the quests with good strategies, you will never beat them. From a story perspective, this is essentially the story of dealing with the fallout from our victory in the faction storyline. Our win against Shiro created a power vacuum that was filled by a burgeoning social and political movement to stamp out corruption in Kantha, of which there was a lot. While the Ministry of Purity's mission began righteously, after they achieved their goal of defeating the remnants of Shiro's plague, they turned on minority groups and other species, and their cleansing of Kantha became very sinister. This is a morally complex storyline and makes strong statements about right-wing nationalism that are impossible to miss. But the most intriguing part of the story is it's our fault as the player character. We killed Shiro, saved the Empire, and then immediately left for Elona. We didn't stay to rebuild or help deal with the aftermath, and as a result, Kantha went to a very dark place. It's a very morally great statement about the value and limits of our player character's ability to change the world. It even ends on an indecisive note where we win, but the Ministry of Purity still exists. And we're about to leave Kantha again, and leave the citizens to deal with the fallout of our battle against the Ministry of Purity, repeating the same mistake that led to the Ministry of Purity's creation in the first place. And from what we've seen and heard about Kantha in Guild Wars 2, things did not improve after we left the second time. All very complex stuff. One of the main differences with Winds of Change as living story content and Guild Wars 2 living story content is that Winds of Change was considered endgame content. ArenaNet's philosophy at the time was that anything other than the normal main quest storyline could be considered optional and was allowed, or even intended to be, slightly harder than normal storyline content, because they assumed that any player who got this far learned something along the way. In Guild Wars 1, since the game was so strategic, ANET figured that anyone who managed to beat the story at least got a viable build and learned how to approach some of the challenging tactical situations that the game faced you with. Guild Wars 2 Living Story, on the other hand, is not considered to be endgame content per se. It's a continuation of the main storyline, and thus is intended to be 100% accessible to 100% of the player base. Since you're never put in a challenging tactical situation in the main Guild Wars 2 storyline or in Living Story, ANET cannot and should not assume that the player has learned anything about the game along the way. And we've seen ANET has released, or not released, but ANET devs have mentioned statistics that showed that skilled players in Guild Wars 2 are up to 10 times better than the average player in Guild Wars 2. This means that ANET cannot increase the difficulty whatsoever in living story content without disenfranchising several members of their player base. In some earlier iterations of Living Story in Guild Wars 2, some individual encounters were given challenge modes that were tied to achievements and gave more or less trivial reward for completing them. As a result, few did. They were really the smallest possible bone that you could throw to players at the higher end of the skill spectrum who, at the time, were quite content-starved. That formula was abandoned in favor of keeping the same easy difficulty, but adding achievements for completing the easy events with certain criteria, like not being hit or under a certain amount of time, or worse, completing that same easy content multiple times. This was, of course, quite welcome to the crowd of players who are motivated solely by achievement points, but it was not a replacement for actual challenging content. I would be remiss, and it wouldn't make sense if I didn't mention the business decisions behind this. Winds of Change was, essentially, an advertisement for Guild Wars 2. It was content added to keep hardcore Guild Wars franchise fans interested in the franchise before Guild Wars 2 launched. Monetization of Guild Wars 1 was not part of the decision of what sort of content and content accessibility Winds of Change was designed to be. The only goal was to keep Guild Wars 1 fans committed to the game of Guild Wars 1 and the franchise of Guild Wars, and to prevent them from buying a sub to WoW or playing another game before Guild Wars 2 launched, keeping them married to the franchise and keeping them there for Guild Wars 2's launch. Guild Wars 2 Living Story, on the other hand, is designed around the cash shop business model. The goal is to have as large a pool of potential players logging into the game coinciding with the largest cash shop cosmetic releases, which go hand in hand with Living Story updates. This means that any player who quits because the content outskilled them and never returns is a lost customer forever. But what about players who get bored of easy content and leave? ANET is counting on the math working out such that for every player lost by making content too easy, they retain multiple lower skill players who will enthusiastically support the cash shop. Obviously, I'm biased towards having more challenging content than less. I make no bones about it. And if Guild Wars 2 was still releasing frequent raid and fractal updates along with the Living Story, I'd really have nothing to complain about with the way that the Living Story is structured from a content perspective. Winds of Change style content in Guild Wars 2, however, would not have been sustainable for Guild Wars 2 for the reasons I outlined above. It was probably too hard for the average Guild Wars 1 player, and was definitely too hard for the average Guild Wars 2 player. And if Living Story came out at the same level of difficulty as Winds of Change normal mode, it would decimate the player base, and more than decimate, since decimate's only 1 in 10, and it would threaten the economic stability of the game. That said, Winds of Change is also a masterpiece of MMO content. The story quality was many tiers above almost any of the rather amateurish plots and stories told in Guild Wars 2. The content in normal mode was challenging but rewarding, and finishing it felt like an accomplishment, even in normal mode. In hard mode, that sense of accomplishment and reward was even higher. Looking forward, it's very hard to split the difference here. ANET cannot financially make the Living Story any harder, nor are challenge modes for encounters a good use of development time. The best solution for Guild Wars 2 is to release dedicated endgame content alongside Living Story, but as we've seen, for a variety of reasons, they appear to be unable to maintain an acceptable release cadence for endgame content parallel with the story. On the positive side, however, Cantha and the End of Dragons expansion that is due to come out in 2021 is a change for Guild Wars 2, or a chance for Guild Wars 2 to reset a little bit. They can tell a story where Elder Dragons are not the main antagonist, but simply exist as a critical challenge amidst a human-centric storyline where politics and personality matter more than perhaps Deus Ex Machina Asura technology solutions to cosmological, existential problems. I don't expect the expansion story content or subsequent Living Story Season 6 content to be any more challenging than any of the content that came before. But at very least, we can hope it's a good deal more interesting, and we can hope that we get a good deal more endgame content in parallel with it. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, and I look forward to reading your comments and thoughts below. Thanks, guys. Have a great day.